how it becomes.
In Lecture 4C, we're going to talk about some of those people who are pushing against Enlightenment rationalism from the 1770s onwards. There's a very brief movement in German literature, in the German arts, that thinks that the Enlightenment is all very well and good, but that it's pushed a little bit too hard in the direction of over-rationalizing things and of taking emotion and feeling and individualism in some ways out of the equation. So we're going to talk about the people involved in this movement, or these series of forces that we could look at as counter currents to the Enlightenment. And in the last lecture, I talked about the rise of Enlightenment thinking at the end of the 18th century. In this lecture, I'm just putting it in a slightly larger context.
When I'm talking about people who are pushing back against the Enlightenment during this period, I'm not talking about people who think that the rights of man are a bad idea, or people who think that civil rights are a bad idea. I'm simply looking at a group of people in the German context who typify a position that says, yes, rational thinking is all very well and good, but what about feelings? What about things that are harder to measure? What about instinct? What about the intangibles that having too much of a reliance on scientific principle means that we lose sight of? So I'm going to just talk about two people in this context, but I could have talked about a number of them. And these two people at some point became friends, and so one had a great influence on the other. The first person I want to talk about is a man called Johann Gottfried Herder. You could forget his first names. He's so famous that he lives on in German culture as a one-name chap. Herder, right? Herder. Herder lived from 1744 to 1803, so he didn't live a very long life, but during that period he was a philosopher and a theoretician. His writings are actually very accessible, even though that sounds quite fancy, philosopher and theoretician. He's very readable and very personable, with a good sense of humor often. He was educated in Königsberg, and he was a student of Immanuel Kant. Remember I showed you that map of Königsberg being way out in East Prussia, and how that was the sort of isolated place that Kant spent most of his life thinking and writing. And Herder is someone who studies under Kant and then moves away from Königsberg, moves back towards the more central parts of the German-speaking world, and lives for some time even in places like Strasbourg. And it was in Strasbourg that he became a friend of the younger man, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Now, if I was to say to you at the beginning of this class, if I were to do a poll and say, before you did anything about German cultural history, have you ever heard of any German writer ever? I'm pretty sure that many of you would have said, oh, there's that Goethe guy, right? And Goethe is the equivalent of Shakespeare, effectively, in the German tradition. He's an extremely important writer, and at the point at which he meets Herder, he's a very young man, and so he's deeply influenced as a young man studying at the university by this man that he meets. So we'll talk about the two of them. Herder was interested in the differences between culture, and so a lot of what he writes about has to do with cultural. It's almost it's before we really see the rise of the field of anthropology, but he is interested in questions that later become the kinds of questions that anthropologists look at. How is that culture different from my culture? And he came up with a theory that each culture is different in its own specific way. And he called these differences that typify a people, let's say, something called a Volksgeist. Volk means a people, a folk, and Geist means a spirit. It also means mind. It means ghost too. It means lots of different words in German. But it's often translated as the spirit of a nation. So he comes up with this theory that every nation has its own particular style, its own particular spirit, and that rather than saying, like someone like Kant might say in his Critique of Judgment, where he's saying what are the universal standards we can use to decide whether something is a good work of art, let's say, or a bad work of art. Herder says these universal standards lose an awful lot if you try to apply them everywhere. What we need to do is look at each culture on its own terms and evaluate, for example, its art or its literature as a product of its own particular contexts. So he often alludes to this idea of the organic when he talks about literature. So Herder would say that a literature should grow from the soil of the place that it emerges, right? So that rather than being literature, for example, but it could be art, could be any of the arts, rather than being, let's say, something that is produced with an eye to the greatest works that have ever been written. Like, let's say you decide Homer was the greatest author ever, and therefore I'm going to model my way of writing on Homer. If that's what you're doing, you're not doing something that's very organic, that's growing like in a grassroots way from where you are. You're imposing a model from outside. And so literature and art grows out of the characteristic traits of a people, according to Herder. Now, I'll pause for a second and say this kind of idea becomes misunderstood and misinterpreted and very much abused in the 20th century, even in the 19th century to some extent, because people begin to judge a particular people as being on a hierarchy, right? Some folk are better than others, and we see this reach its apex, of course, in the rhetoric of the and the politics of the Nazis. But we cannot. This is an example of how we have to be very careful when we look at the historical past, not to impose on it all of the things that have happened between the point at which something was written and today, right? So something like the idea of a Volksgeist, or the spirit of a national spirit or something like that, comes with a lot of baggage if we're thinking about it in 2020, right? Because we've seen the damage it can do to imagine that there's racial superiority or racial difference even, or folkish difference among different peoples. But this is not the spirit in which Herder is originally writing. He's writing precisely against prejudice. He's saying we need to, in the 18th century, instead of saying everything needs to be judged by one universal standard, and that's the standard of classicism, of antiquity, of ancient Greece or ancient Rome, he says, no, we need to judge according to what is the best expression of the traits of that particular people. So this, you can see already in the language I've used to describe this theory of Herder's, how it pushes against the universalizing modes of Enlightenment thinking, right? So someone like Kant is thinking, what are the universals? And someone like Herder is saying, universals may mean that we lose sight of specifics. Now, Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and pronounce that name. If I was in class live with you, I'd get everybody to say the name Goethe. Don't say Goethe as if there's an R there. That's a real tell that that you're not really, well, it doesn't sound great. So just say Goethe. It doesn't have to be Goethe or something, just Goethe. So practice that for 1 second. Goethe, as a young man, studied in Strasbourg from 1770 to 1772, and he befriends Herder, and he begins to read what Herder has to say about national styles in the arts, and it goes through a kind of epiphany. Goethe has this moment where he says, oh my God, all of my education has taught me that the classical style is the thing we should emulate, that we should always be looking to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans for a model of how to make the greatest art that there ever was. But actually, influenced by Herder, Goethe says, do you know what? There are some pretty magnificent things that are typically German, that aren't at all classical in that sense. They don't come from the ancients. They emerge out of German medieval city building, that I think are extraordinary, because they are perfect expressions of the spirit of the folk, of this Volksgeist that Herder talked about. And the reason this slide is entitled Goethe on Strasbourg Cathedral is that one of the readings that is an optional reading for this course, but you'll find it under the Readings tab, is an essay called On German Architecture that Goethe wrote in 1772. And in that essay, which is a wonderful essay, I really encourage you to read it if you've got time, Goethe says, well, here I am, this young fella, and I've been trained to think that the classical style is the best style there is, and that the Gothic style is some sort of medieval hodgepodge of nonsense, because it isn't a great classical, in the great ancient classical tradition. And then I went to see Strasbourg Cathedral, and I was blown away, because I felt this, as I say, this epiphany, this moment where it felt like the ghosts of the Middle Ages spoke to me. So again, he has a little vision of the architect of this particular building whispering in his ear and making him feel things very deeply. These are all the kinds of reactions that the Enlightenment would say are not the kinds of reactions we ought to have when we come to something, to judge it or to criticize it, or to say this is good art or this is bad art, this is good architecture, this is bad architecture. The Enlightenment would say there are principles and you should hive to those principles, and it's kind of an intellectual exercise to decide whether something is great or something is not great. And Goethe says, actually, do you know what? That's rubbish. The fact that I felt what I felt, the fact that I had this intuition, this ghostly presence whispering in my ear, and this glorious moment of just being astounded by the beauty of this of this particular building, means that I've been educated in a very poor way, and that I need to be paying more attention to how I feel. And I invite you, in this essay, Goethe says to people, I invite you, dear reader, to come and look at this and to see if it makes you feel the same. And if it doesn't make you feel the same, that's grand. Off you go to Paris, I don't care. You can look at their new architecture there and enjoy that. But anybody who feels the same as me can stay with me in Strasbourg, and we'll look at this cathedral and we'll feel our feelings, right? So Goethe's essay von deutscher Baukunst is how it is in German. He calls it On German Architecture. We're becoming back to this title at some point when we talk about the rise of the idea of there being German styles in the early 19th century, going hand in hand with the rise of nationalism. But in 1772, here's Goethe already saying, there's a German style and it sings to me, it makes my heart sing. So this text is considered, Goethe's text on German architecture, even though it's an essay, is considered an important work of the so-called Storm and Stress movement. And you're like, what's the Storm and Stress movement? From 1767 to 1785, it sounds awfully specific. What on earth is this? Well, the German phrase for it is Sturm und Drang, which actually means more like storm and force. Drang is a kind of an impulse, something that pushes you in a particular direction. But historically, we've always, literary historians and others have often translated it as storm and stress, which is why I'm sticking with storm and stress for this movement. It is a short-lived movement among a group of writers and thinkers who are young, who have kind of a fresh sense that Enlightenment thinking is narrowing their vision rather than expanding their vision. And so for this very intense period of 10-15 years, they're writing against that kind of the intellectualization that they see going on in the overemphasis on the rational that they see going on in the Enlightenment movement. So Herder's essay on New German literature is considered very often the earliest expression. I'm not going to talk about that, but that's where one of the places where he talks about every nation having its own spirit, and the best that gets written fits with the spirit of the nation rather than fitting with some overarching abstract principle. He publishes that essay in 1767, so that's often seen as a marker of the beginning of this grassroots movement that we call Storm and Stress. It's an intellectual movement, and if we weren't being as specific as looking at Herder's essay, we would say it's the 1770s, right? Sometimes this period is also called the Geniezeit, or the period of the genius, because there is a cult of the genius among these storm and stress folks. So if we think of what Enlightenment thinking does, Enlightenment thinking says there are universal truths or there are universal principles, and we can all, we're all on this journey towards getting enlightenment, right? Becoming in the kind of very kind of step-by-step fashion, becoming enlightened people. And the storm and stress crowd says, well, actually, some people already get it. Some people have an innate brilliance and an innate, they say the word genius all the time. And these people are the people who are best, for example, express in their literary writings or in their art, they best express the spirit of their era and the spirit of the place where they are. So we see the word genius and the focus on individuals, not individuals becoming part of a sort of a common group that's striving towards some enlightened ideal, but individuals who burst forth and break with convention in many, many ways and who do things that end up being fantastic works. This is not important. This is just, where does the word come from? There was a guy called Klinger who wrote a play called Sturm und Drang, so that's where we get the name of the movement. But as a movement, it is a movement against tradition, against bourgeois morals, against classicism, which is on the rise in the 18th century. We'll talk about that in a future lecture, against the Enlightenment. And so there's a series of things that we can contrast with one another. They privilege and they think that nature, organic things, passionate feelings, individuals being geniuses like Shakespeare or Homer are positive things, and they reject rules and regulations and norms. They reject the one-sided rationalism of the Enlightenment, and they reject convention. So here's a list of yeah, we like that, we don't like that. So not being objective, but being subjective in the way you look at things. Not being traditional, but being spontaneous. Not having these kind of moral strictures, but feeling passionate and so on. So here's a list of the kinds of things they contrast with one another. Mostly it's remembered as a movement that produced a lot of important poetry and a lot of important novels. So Goethe's, it's not a poem, Goethe's Die Leiden des jungen Werthers in 1774, The Sorrows of Young Werther, is a novel in which a young man called Werther is in love with a woman. She herself is engaged to a man who's very much an Enlightenment thinker. And Werther is the opposite. Werther is a young, passionate, unconventional, nature-loving, enthusiastic and exuberant individual who wants her to be in love with him. She isn't really in love with him, but he wants that to be true. And so it's an epistolary novel. So it's a novel that's written in letters. So it's a fascinating thing to read because part of it, by being letters written by Werther, you kind of see things from his perspective and you're pulled into his point of view. But the response letters that he gets let you read between the lines of what other people are thinking about the way he acts. And in the end, there's an editor who comes in and who kind of makes an intervention at the end of the novel and says, look, what Werther did and the way he handled this was not actually a very smart way of handling all of this. Here's some other works that are considered important plays of the Storm and Stress movement. But Werther is the big one. Note that in this image we have Charlotte, who he's in love with, playing music for him, and he, in this pose, of course this isn't an image by Goethe, but it's a typical illustration of Werther. He's looking away, he's looking deeply into the distance almost, and thinking and feeling based on the music she's playing. The child who's standing at Werther's lap is one of Charlotte's younger sisters, so Charlotte is a kind of mother-like figure in this text. He's wearing a blue coat and yellow trousers. Well, you think that might be random, but in the book, Werther is described as wearing an outfit of yellow trousers and a blue coat. And Goethe's book becomes a bestseller to the extent that you can have a bestseller in the 1770s. Goethe is this young guy. I mean, he's in his early 20s. He's just gotten done studying. He's not famous, and then he writes this book, and all of a sudden his name is on the lips of every reader in Europe. It's translated into English, it's translated into French. By the 19th century, people are writing operas based on Werther, and Werther becomes this household name. And Werther's passion, people love the character of Werther. It starts all kinds of cult followings, including lots of people wearing blue coats and yellow trousers after the style of Werther. So watch out whenever anybody creates a movie that's a historical movie. Just keep your eye out. Have they dressed any character in yellow trousers and a blue coat? Because that's a giveaway that they're making that character seem a little bit like Werther, the famous Werther. Goethe was mad at the fact that Werther was the thing he was most famous for, because he thought it wasn't his best work. And in fact, he thought Werther was a bit of a fool to go too far into his passions and never, ever let rational thinking hold sway in his life. So Goethe, whose sympathies are a little bit with the editor at the end of his novel, rolls his eyes at so many people coming to him and saying, visiting the place where he lives in Weimar, and saying, I had to meet the author of Werther. There's a point in Goethe's life where Napoleon Bonaparte is going through town, and he wants to meet Goethe because he wants to meet the man who wrote Werther. And this is like after Goethe has written his most famous works, like Faust and things like that. So it both made his name, it made him a wealthy man in some ways, but it also made him roll his eyes, because he looks back on it later and he thinks, oh my God, those are my Sturm und Drang years where I was feeling like a teenager, and actually, as a mature man, I look back at it and I think it's not a very balanced book, but Goethe's Werther is huge. And I'm going to stop talking about Sturm und Drang by showing you a poem that Goethe also wrote around the same time called Prometheus in 1773, and this is a translation of a part of that poem, and the drawing on the right is a drawing by Goethe of the figure of Prometheus. We know that Prometheus is the figure who, in mythology, stole fire from the gods and gave it to man, and so as a punishment he was chained to a rock and condemned to having his liver pecked out, I think, every day, something like that, and then it regenerates, and the next day he has to go through the same horrible torture of having his liver pecked out by a bird. So this is Goethe's artistic interpretation of Prometheus, but let's look at what he's saying in the poem. It's the voice of Prometheus saying, speaking to Zeus. Zeus is the god who he has offended by stealing fire, and you can see in the image that there's lightning that's representing that fire. And so the voice of Prometheus talking to Zeus says these words: I should honor you? For what? Have you softened the sufferings ever of the burdened? Have you stilled the tears of the anguished? Was I not forged as a man by almighty time and the eternal fate, my masters, time and fate, as well as yours? So he's putting himself on a footing with the great god Zeus and saying, you and I are equals. So this is, in a way, by taking fire symbolically from the gods, Prometheus tries to make man equal to the gods. And here in this poem by Goethe, Goethe is also making Prometheus use words that say, I am equal to you. And then the final lines of this poem are, here I sit, forming people in my image, a race like me, to suffer, to weep, these are emotions, right, to enjoy and delight themselves, and to mock you, Zeus, as I do. So this is a poem that is suggesting that man invents himself rather than the gods inventing man, that man creates people in his own likeness, and that is this transition that has happened from the world in which the gods reigned to the world in which man reigns. So it's suggestive of an enormous transition that's happening in European society in general over the course of these several hundred years, but also of the specific central figure that individuals become in the Storm and Stress movement, later on in the Romantic movement too, but in the modern era, as we see the rise of democracy and democratic movements and human rights and so on. We can read so much into this very young poem by Goethe. This is just to remind you that if you ever heard the word Sturm und Drang, if you're a Harry Potter fan, you'll know that the name of the German equivalent to Hogwarts is Durmstrang, and J.K. Rowling has done that on purpose. It's a spoonerism. She's switched the initial consonants. So instead of Sturmdrang, it's Durmstrang. And she's done this on purpose. And the only reason I point this out is to point out to you that Sturm und Drang is a phrase that you will hear, and that is that people don't often translate it, and it's such a key association with the German soul or the German spirit that it can be the subject of a joke by a very smart writer in the 1990s. Okay, I didn't go through it, but at the end of the lectures on the Enlightenment, I've got a takeaway. I'm putting it in again here so that you can read it and think about the whole context of today's two lectures on the century of reason, the rise of the Enlightenment, and then the counter-currents to the Enlightenment, which I've just talked about. And if you have one major takeaway, maybe it's this bullet point, that the Enlightenment sought to find universal values in common to all men and women, and some were German-speaking poets, and some German-speaking poets that were beginning to wonder whether there were traits that made specific nations, ethnic groups, special, and even unique individualism, whether that should be celebrated rather than some generic ideal of mankind. So that's a kind of an encapsulation of what I've been trying to say about how the countercurrents to the Enlightenment, of which we're going to find many over the next few days, the one that happens at the same time, that's this short-lived Sturm und Drang movement, that's its objection to Enlightenment thinking.